The first Der Klassiker of the new Bundesliga season was a game which Bayern Munich ultimately won 2-1 against Borussia Dortmund. But perhaps more interestingly, I thought it was a really intriguing match that was undoubtedly well contested, but also a game which really showcased that both of these teams are still very much a work in progress. And I'd like to explain why that's the case for both of them in this video. First things first, Bayern Munich absolutely dominated the first half. I've struggled to remember a more dominant performance over the course of 45 minutes than Bayern Munich against Dortmund on Saturday night. Michael Olise was absolutely everywhere. He was unplayable, unstoppable. And then on the other wing, they had Luis Diaz, who was constant threat when he was cutting inside against Dortmund's attacking players. He caused all sorts of problems for Rierson and Anton. And then in the middle of the pitch, you had Harry Kane playing this more reserved number 10 role, which I did a video on a few weeks ago, playing almost as Bayern's de facto playmaker. And I thought he was outstanding. And I thought Bayern were outstanding over the course of the first half. Of course, they got their first goal through Harry Kane scoring that header from the corner, but it was a performance which Bayern should have seen Bayern go into the half-time 2, 3, maybe even 4 goals up. And Dortmund really struggled to even put up any sort of fight against them. But, and this is really why we love football, things changed very quickly in the second half. Dortmund tweaked their tactics, which I'll come on to in a moment. But the important thing from a Bayern point of view is that it really did a good job of nullifying Olise, Diaz and Harry Kane. I thought Olise really struggled to kind of break into the final third as much as he had in the first half. I thought Diaz looked quite isolated on the left wing, and Harry Kane went from being this kind of box-to-box playmaker to a player who was constantly involved in these kind of scraps with a far more tenacious Dortmund midfield and defence. And that was ultimately a huge problem for Bayern because Vincent Kompany turned to his bench, and the only player he could really look to kind of turn the game back into Bayern's favour was Leon Goretzka. Now, huge fan of Leon Goretzka, and 4 or 5 years ago, he would have been the perfect player to win this fixture for Bayern Munich. But now he's a bit of a shadow of his former self, and by no means a player that would be walking onto the pitch to suddenly turn this game back into Bayern's favour in an attacking sense. Now, obviously, Bayern did get their second goal, and that proved to be the winner, but that was more down to Joe Bellingham's individual mistake, which Olise was able to capture on, rather than any tactical shift or system change that turned the game back into Bayern's favour. Fundamentally, Kompany didn't have a plan B when his plan A didn't work. And I think that's really fascinating. Now, I should point out that Serge Gnabry picked up an injury just before the game, and he would have obviously started. But if you think about the kind of ramifications of that, that really just means Nicolas Jackson falls back to the bench. And while Jackson's a very good striker, he's not exactly a player that Bayern or Vincent Kompany could have brought in to alleviate the likes of Diaz or Michael Olise or that Bayern midfield, which was really struggling to contain Dortmund in the second half. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, Dortmund did make some big changes in the second half. Niko Kovac, quite crucially, took off the frankly calamitous Niklas Süle and replaced him with Rami Bensebaini, who I think is a far more technically gifted player and a player that allowed Dortmund to soak up pressure in their own defensive third, pass beyond that Bayern counter press, and really kind of get the ball up the pitch. As a result, it allowed Dortmund to get out of their own half, it allowed them to start dominating the middle of the pitch, and as we saw in the second half, create far more chances against Bayern Munich. It also fundamentally allowed Nico Schlotterbeck to move into the centre of defence, where he orchestrated everything Dortmund did well, either defensively or in attacking sense. He really was pulling the strings throughout this match. And it was such a huge shift from seeing him run around putting out fires in the first half to seeing him gallop up the pitch and making these remarkable through balls into the final third against Bayern Munich. It was a fantastic performance. I thought Dortmund, honestly, were the better team in the second half. And again, if not for an individual mistake from Joe Bellingham, I think Kovac's team would have walked away from this game with at least a point. So in a sense, Kovac did get his tactics right. It was just a little bit too late. And with the power of hindsight, we can see that maybe starting a defensive midfielder like Pascal Gross over an attacking player like Maximilian Bayer, or a more defensively obvious stalwart central defender like Niklas Süle over a more technically gifted Remy Bensebaini, suggests to me that Kovac has some second thoughts about the plan A and his go-to starting 11, which he has stuck with throughout the entire season, up until coming up against a team like Bayern Munich. And perhaps ironically, if he had stuck with his plan A from the first whistle, we might have seen a very different Dortmund performance in the first half and ultimately a very different result on Saturday night. And this is why it's so interesting. Ultimately, Bayern Munich and Borussia Dortmund are two teams looking to get to this final destination, but they're approaching it from opposite ends of the spectrum. Vincent Kompany at Bayern Munich knows his best players, he knows his best tactics, and he is rigidly sticking with his plan A. The problem is he doesn't have that strength and depth in his squad to turn to a plan B if and when necessary, as we saw in the second half of this game. But in stark contrast, Kovac had plenty of options on the bench in Julian Brandt and Maximilian Bayer, two players that I'm sure Kompany would have loved to have been able to bring off the bench for Bayern Munich tonight. But unlike Kompany, he lacked the courage and conviction to stick with his plan B in an important game like a team like Bayern Munich. So it'll be really interesting to see where both of these teams go. They're both approaching problems from opposite ends of the spectrum, and we'll have to wait and see whether either of them can get to their finishing line before the end of the season and ultimately pick up some serious silverware. But it was a match which Bayern Munich won. They won 2-1. They get all 3 points. I'd be really intrigued to see where both these teams are when they play each other once again in the second half of the season.